Welcome to the Addiction Connection podcast, connecting the hope of the gospel with the heart of addiction. I'm your host, Mark Shaw. Today's podcast is the first of a two-part series with Dr. Daniel Berger, where he and I discuss phenomenology and the history of the mental health field. Now, this is a little different than most of my podcasts, but you're going to listen into a series of conversations that I had with Dr. Berger, who is the pastor of Faith Fellowship Church in Clarence, New York. He's also an author of many books, including Saving Abnormal. He has a new book on suicide. He has books on rethinking depression, the chemical imbalance theory, ADHD, mental illness. I mean, he has volumes of books. Just a really incredible researcher and a good thinker who helps us to think about mental illness in a biblical way. And so you're going to listen in to part of the conversation that we had in preparation for my church's annual CDT, Counseling and Discipleship Training event. So at Grace Fellowship Church, where I'm the director of counseling, we have an event coming up September 16th, 17th, and 18th. That's a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And Dr. Berger is one of our featured speakers at that event. He came in town, and I was able to interview him, and we videoed the interview, and it is on our platform for the CDT event. The great thing about the CDT event is that it is live streamed. So you'll be able to get it whether you're listening to me in Alaska or Hawaii or California or one of those far off places. You can listen, or overseas, you can listen to this event quite easily as it's live streamed. Maybe a different time zone, but that's okay. You can adjust and maybe sleep in a little bit the next day if you have to stay up a little bit later. Well, I guess if you're in Alaska, it's actually going to be earlier. So that's even better news, right? But we're excited about the CDT event, and especially this event, which is the biblical approach to mental illness is our theme. We have Pastor Peter LaRufa, Pastor Steve Ham. I'm going to teach on substance use disorder, and Dr. Daniel Berger is going to talk about a variety of topics at CDT. So I hope you'll sign up for the entire CDT event. This will give you just a little glimpse into some of what we're going to teach and talk about at CDT. So this, again, is the first of a two-part series with Dr. Daniel Berger, where we discuss phenomenology and the history of the mental health field. Let's listen in now. I want to run through a few terms. I just thought about this. So epistemology, what does that mean?
So it's a field of study of truth, essentially. And everyone, whether you're a believer in Christ or a secularist, has to begin with epistemology, because all of us are approaching life through a presuppositional epistemology, through a lens of is there objective truth? Is it subjective? Do I make it, is it like we're seeing on the news media, is it a narrative or is it something that's outside of me? Science itself is a field of attempting to discover what is true, right? So science is not a thing in itself. It's a form of epistemology. And we briefly mentioned in previous videos that we have filmed that the whole COVID mess in 2020, we saw that science was not actually fact. Science is thrown around like as to beat people up in many cases or to control them. Yeah. And I'm not making a political statement. I'm just simply saying you had people who were allegedly scientific figures saying one thing and then 2 weeks later saying the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. So what? And it's not that new evidence came about. It was that they were selectively choosing what to present as science. So epistemology is really our authority of what is true. Right. And of course, as believers, we know that God and His Word are the the way, the truth, and the life, the truth. All truth originates from him. It is his. So that's just a very quick answer of epistemology.
That's good. Yeah, just real quick. Phenomenology. Just define that, and again, quickly.
So that term originated in the Kraepelinian era when Wilhelm Wundt and Kraepelin were developing psychology, psychiatry into the medical model. And essentially, they don't know how within materialism, within a view that we're only material or biological reductionism, they don't know how to explain phenomena such as the human soul. They would say the human soul is not something real, it's just a phenomena. So the brain and the genes are producing this phenomena. So the first thing they do is try to explain the human soul. They call it consciousness. But we're talking about the exact same thing, the psyche, the soul, however you want to describe that. And then second of all, the phenomena that occur in the soul. So anxiety, for example, it's a very real thing, but it's not something approachable in science. We can approach the behaviors, we can approach the physical effects, but anxiety itself, no one has actually pulled that out of the soul or the heart, the spiritual heart, and examined it using the scientific methods.
So you can't pull it out, lay it on a table, and examine it.
Right. And yet we go to the doctor and they say on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious are you? How depressed are you? Well, whose scale and what exactly are we? But these are real phenomena.
Right.
So phenomenology is attempting to reduce everything to a field of study. And that's actually why psychiatry is invaluable to them. But we do this in a scriptural way. We are biblical phenomenologists. What we're doing is taking mindsets, emotions, and even behavior that is very real. But the mindsets, the emotions are not physical. They're metaphysical. They're phenomena.
Right.
They're real things, but we're looking at them through a biblical lens. So everybody's a phenomenologist. It's just worldview is another way of saying that. So
that's good. Kraepelinianism, we're going to get to that in a minute. So talk to me a little bit about the history of the mental health field and just some of the things we were talking about before.
Yeah, well, in not just regard to the mental health field or construct in general, but even addiction. The history really begins. I mean, there's been like very elementary theories, and people will pull up this and that. But even Franz Anton Mesmer, people like that. But Benjamin Rush really is the guy who attempted to medicalize phenomena. Right. So that's the beginning of the medical model. And for those who are into history will know that's one of our founding fathers in the United States. He's also the face of the American Psychiatric Association for good reason. Most historians, like Stephen Fried, credit Benjamin Rush with being the father of psychology, psychiatry, and addiction medicine. In fact, Stephen Fried in his book, Benjamin Rush, that's exactly, I'm almost quoting verbatim. That's what he says. So it's well known. Penn Medical School was founded off of Benjamin Rush's theories. And the very first alleged mental illness that Rush suggested was actually addiction. And that really began this concept of taking what is immaterial, but we know is real, and putting it into a medical framework in order to try to approach it. And that's historic fact. But and another historic fact is that his good friend John Adams, one of the big names in American history, he and Rush were very good friends, and John Adams' son actually died from overdosing or consuming alcohol. Essentially, he had a real problem with alcohol. That's another historic fact. This part is, I'm deducing, is speculative, but I think there's a legitimate. I think there's enough evidence to make this deduction. Rush actually formed his theory of addiction based on trying to justify and explain to his friend John Adams what happened to his son, And again, there's enough evidence in their letters to each other to conclude that. So I'm speculating there, but again, it's based on things they shared with each other. But that was the beginning of the medical model. And if you think about the entire medical model, it is an attempt to explain phenomena. That's all it is. I say it's actually a failure to explain. When they can't explain, they just categorize and label people, and we don't know why someone's delusional. Well, that's schizophrenia. It doesn't make any sense. But if you get to know them, it does make sense.
Right.
And you know that with addictions, if what the world calls addictions, if you get to know them, you know what's driving their pursuit. It's either the lust of the flesh or an attempt to dissociate from, I don't want to deal with reality. It's either pleasure or I just don't want to deal with what I've gone through. And the more you get to know people, it does make sense. So we don't need that false explanation. Rush just didn't have an answer to give, unfortunately, and he claimed to be a believer. Grew up Presbyterian, but we do have answers, and so we don't need that false failure really to explain that is claimed so often to explain.
So the medicalization of something that's behavioral, according to the Bible. I mean, drunkenness is a choice.
Right.
They tried to medicalize it. They tried to say this is the problem, and we know how to treat it in a medical way with drugs, or of course not maybe back then, but today that's the process.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about how that evolved with Kraepelinianism and all that. Yeah,
well, and I'll go back to Rush first. The entire medical model is first to blame it on or theorize, I should say, that there's something in the body that is causing these phenomena. So that's fundamental number one, if you would, of the medical model. Number two is to come up with a physical solution. Because if it's physical, then there's got to be a physical solution. So Rush did three things. First of all, he bled people out. So bloodletting.
That's right.
Yeah, historically, it's well known that he took people's lives, and I'm not saying he didn't have good intentions.
No, right. Right.
I really think he believed that this was scientific and this was beneficial, as numerous other doctors did too.
Yeah.
But he actually got sued. There's a lot, if you go look at the history, that he was taking people's lives, and it's a really sad situation. There's a positive aspect of Rush too. I don't want to diminish that. Sure. He did save people's life with yellow fever and all that occurred. There's a lot of similarities between what happened with COVID and yellow fever. And Rush actually stayed put and helped people. So I don't want to just set him up as a monster. Yeah. I really believe he wanted to help people, but if you don't have truth, you can't do that. Right. Another thing he did was he had what's called bilious pills, were like laxatives, just horrific laxatives. He invented a chair that would spin, and until people vomited, he wouldn't let them off. So if you can imagine his clinic, it's bloody vomit and diarrhea everywhere. Not
Great
to be crass,
smells.
but but that began this attempt to treat the soul, the mind, the psyche, however you want to describe that, using material goods. And fast forward to Emil Kraepelin in Nazi Germany. It was, if we can't treat them, and by the way, his major thing before he developed his constructs of schizophrenia and bipolar, and the whole medical model was actually addiction. So after World War I, what we would call today post-traumatic stress, he actually saw when soldiers came back that they were very distraught and something wasn't right. So that began his genetic theory, hereditary theory of madness, and which we know is eugenics, today called psychiatric genetics. But addictions and post-traumatic stress were his two biggies. Wow. And he actually studied addictions more than anything to propagate this idea that Benjamin Rush had come up with, the hereditary madness that he developed into eugenics. So went from hereditary to the idea that genes are causing people to be addicts. That was his theory. And then, of course, he developed schizophrenia, bipolar with the same theory, which led to the Holocaust. And today, there's different theories of genes, whether it's a single gene theory or the polygenomic theory, like there's many, or the omnigenomic theory that all of, the entire genome causes this type thing, which we have actually circled back to Rush's theory. But I digress on that. Anyway, the point being that Rush's theory of addictions is still seen today as the prominent theme of psychiatry. Now, schizophrenia is their baby, but addictions really is if we show, which has been done. You've done, written a lot on this, spoken a lot on this, as you said, whether you want to or not.
Yeah.
God's called you this, which I'm so appreciative for. But if this is a heart issue and a flesh issue, the Bible describes that. This is a biblical issue. And no matter how you want to spin it, it's either accepting the authority, epistemology, again, of God's word, or the authority of Rush and others like him. It's man's opinion about the exact same phenomena.
Yeah, in counseling, we use that Y diagram a lot, especially around our church, which is the moment where you have a choice. Am I going to go God's way, obey his word, follow him, or am I going to go the way of man and theories or self? And I think about that with all of this. I mean, there's really two choices. It's God's word or Rush, Benjamin Rush, Emil Kraepelin, those guys. I'm going to follow that model of thinking, Freud and Skinner and all those guys.
Yeah, and it really is what they call, and again, I don't mind this term, phenomenology. Some of the secular terms we need to completely denounce and avoid.
Sure.
But I think phenomenology, it's a descriptive title to that field, and I think it's very helpful. We go through phenomena. Like if I tell you, Mark, I feel like you don't like me, that may or may not be true, but I'm expressing what's in my soul. And so you are now getting to listen to, and of course in biblical counseling, we are warning people of not acting on feeling, but at the same time, we are very much listening to the words of their mouth expose what's in their soul, and we want to draw that out. We want to know what they're feeling. And so it's actually a good thing to hear what people are feeling, but then to say, let's let truth come in and remove, replace, put off, put on, what is in your soul, what you're thinking about incorrectly or correctly. And in some cases, like sorrow, as an example, they're actually feeling correctly. They're being honest about real life. So we're not even replacing that. We're helping them to understand why they're sorrowful. So phenomenology is, whether we realize it or not, in every relationship, it's vital. And so, yeah.
It's hard to even get over the fact that addiction was their first. We always hear about schizophrenia and this and that, but really mental illness, that entire field kicked off by addiction. I mean, that kind of blows my mind.
Well, and if you think about it rationally, in their rationale, you're consuming a chemical, that's a psychoactive drug. Alcohol was one of the first psychiatric drugs to treat depression, anxiety, allegedly. Now obviously that's laughed at, but then it was science, it was, and the drugs today actually don't do much different at all in their drug action. They're doing this, they're actually depressing the nervous system the same way. But it makes sense that if you think, okay, a person consuming alcohol, they go mad, right? And to use their verbiage, they go insane, right? That's not really who they are. Well, Proverbs tells us, I think it's Proverbs 26, that if you look upon the wine when it is red, and the verse is actually expressing drunkenness, that you'll crawl up the mask and say, who is beating me? And no one is there. And then you wake up the next morning and you're like, okay, and give me another one, type thing. That is delusional thing. It's hallucinations. It's like, do you not see what's... So they're trying to explain madness historically.
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense because Scripture talks about if you consume these psychoactive drugs, it will take control of your mind. And I think even of in Ephesians where God tells us not to be overcome with alcohol or wine specifically, but to be filled with the Spirit. Mm-hmm. So there's a control and dependence there that he's actually using. These chemicals exist because they reflect something we need to understand. In other words, God in his creation is teaching us about himself. And we can take mind-altering drugs, but God wants us to consume, to be transcended by being filled with the Spirit, being controlled by the Spirit.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Kraepelin. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Asperger's and Alzheimer's and just get into those issues as well, because as biblical counselors, we're going to hear about that, see that, meet with people in that realm. So,
so there's if you studied Asperger 25 years ago, you would think he was almost a saint. That's how tainted the history records, and especially in the United States, were.
I thought we had to trust history.
Right. But a lot of historians have actually been honest now, and a lot of the German records have been translated so that historians that don't speak German are now more aware of actually what took place.
Yeah.
And what they found was Asperger actually discovered in what today we call autism or autism spectrum disorder. Mm-hmm. And he was actually in charge. He was one of the main guys in charge of attempting to treat what they were calling eventually Asperger's, but it was feeble-mindedness is how they framed it back then. And sadly, what they were really doing eventually is killing off these children. And it's despicable, but Asperger was heavily involved in this. And even though he wasn't committed to the Nazi party, he was in full agreement with them. He complied with them. He suggested taking these children's lives. And so the history has now revealed that, and that's why Asperger's has been removed. You don't find it in the DSM-5 because they're trying to distance themselves. Same with Louis Alzheimer. Louis Alzheimer was not a Nazi, but he worked under Emil Kraepelin. And what happened was he disagreed with Kraepelin. And if Kraepelin couldn't explain why someone was going through delusions, hallucinations, he would just call it premature dementia, which became schizophrenia. So when I say premature or dementia precox, as he called it in German. So what happened was Alzheimer's patient, one of his patients passed away, and he did an autopsy, and he actually discovered biological markers, which were the plaques and tangles that identify today, and there's still not a diagnostic measure because you can't cut open a live person's brain.
Right.
Hopefully there will be a diagnosis capabilities that we can develop here very soon for Alzheimer's disease, which is a legitimate disease. But you find it listed in the DSM-5 along with autism as if it were a mental disorder. And these are actually the ways that Kraepelin sold his theory. These are legitimate brain dysfunction or disease disorder. Therefore, addiction, schizophrenia, bipolar, PTS, panic, we're going to find those in the brain too. And this has been the hypothesis for decades now. There's no science behind this versus these legitimate things. And so it's very, very crafty and deceitful how Satan has sold this. And people just assume now that there's actually science for schizophrenia, bipolar, addiction. And as you know, there's not. There's the science is, this is our theory, therefore it's scientific because we're testing to see if we can find this to be true.
Right.
So it's sickening when you start realizing where this came from and what was going on in the Holocaust and how all this is related.
It blows people away, and I learned this from you. But when counseling comes in and I talk to them about Asperger's, I say, why don't we hear about that anymore? Did you know they're not, and then I give them that history, my version of it, the best way I can regurgitate it. But I tell them that, and they're blown away. And it's the same with thinking about how Nazism and mental health are related. Could you speak to that a little bit? I know that's a can of worms, but people need to know the truth.
Yeah, I'll just give a very in my book Saving Abnormal
Yes.
is where I really lay this out. If you want the history, the philosophies behind this,
Yes.
The alleged science, I go through that, and then also the theology. And that may sound weird, a theology of genetics, but our very field of hamartiology, the study of sin originating with Adam, we believe it's passed down genetically. We inherit the sin nature.
Yeah.
So there's got to be a theology here, which is actually what I believe seculars are, not just sin, but as we've talked about the human weakness as well, they're trying to explain those two things within this paradigm. But Emil Kraepelin, again, built on Benjamin Rush's theory, and he really formalized, and that was the big thing. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. People don't realize that America was leading eugenics. It wasn't Nazi Germany. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming that the Nazis came to the United States to learn the eugenic theory, whether it was the Carnegie Institute, whether it was the Rockefeller Foundation that actually funded the Kraepelinian Institute. So the first half of the Holocaust was actually funded by the United States. And it wasn't until the final solution when the SS took over. So Kraepelin was intimately influencing the world with this theory of eugenics, and that's what it was. The Holocaust was a psychiatric experiment. Hitler was a side item. He really was, and that sounds weird, but the first extermination camp was a psychiatric ward. The protege of Emil Kraepelin was Ernst Rudin, who was a psychiatrist, a genetic psychiatrist, who, if you Google him, he's known as the father of Nazi eugenics. I mean, he wrote all the Nazi legislation for sterilization. I mean, he's the one who governed all of Nazi medicine. It is just disturbing when you start realizing this was a big psychiatric experiment. And Rudin's right-hand man was Joseph Franz Kalman, and Kalman was Jewish, just like others like Viktor Frankl. There was a lot of Jewish psychiatrists at that time that were just like other psychiatrists were studying under Kraepelin. And when Rudin said, "Look, we've already eliminated this group of alleged degenerates," Kraepelin had his list, including, by the way, Kraepelin labeled the Jews, the Gypsies, and the blacks as degenerates. A lot of people don't realize, again, this is a Kraepelinian theory.
Yeah.
He told Kalman, "You got to get out of here." And so Kalman fled to the United States, and he didn't get rid of eugenics. He brought it with him. And that's why today our mental health system is called neo-Kraepelinian. It is, some people disguise it as the biopsychosocial model or the medical model.
Right.
But it is Kraepelinian. It's one of the DSM-5, psychopharmacology. These are all Kraepelinian concepts and even terms like psychopharmacology. So you can't separate, and I will say this as well. We are seeing eugenics full force in our country. We are seeing history repeat itself, and eugenics thrives off of that division of people, whether it's ethnic background, whether it's religion. Kraepelin, actually, if you study Kraepelin, he didn't just label people who he couldn't explain as mentally ill or schizophrenic. He labeled anyone who disagreed with him politically. And this is widely understood. We're seeing that today.
Yeah.
Because if you control concepts of truth, going back to epistemology,
Right.
then you decide who has false fixed beliefs, who is delusional.
Right.
You decide who is insane and
Right.
who is crazy. And we're seeing this today.
We'll pause here and finish this conversation in the next podcast, where we post the conclusion of this conversation with Dr. Daniel Berger. You can find out more about Dr. Daniel Berger and his publications at drdanielberger.com, and you can register for our annual CDT. You'll want to sign up for the advanced track where our guests will be featured speakers at graceky.org/CDT. That's graceky.org/CDT. Thanks for joining me. Take care and God bless.